At the pinnacle of his new life, with his perfect new partner Sienna glittering on his arm, Lionel Dawson believed he had orchestrated his own happiness. He stood before the city's elite at a lavish charity gala, held in the very house he once shared with his ex-wife, ready to deliver the speech that would cement his success. But he never finished that first sentence, because the grand oak doors swung open and the woman he had callously discarded a year ago walked in. This was not the broken, weeping Marina he'd left behind. This woman was transformed, radiating a steel-like confidence he'd never seen before. And she was holding a secret in her arms that was about to burn his meticulously constructed world to ashes. The silence in their Boston brownstone was a new phenomenon. For 7 years, the home of Lionel and Marina Dawson had been filled with the low hum of contentment, the scent of old books from Marina's study, the sound of classical music drifting from the living room speakers, the clinking of wine glasses as they dissected their days. Lionel was a rising star at Price & Dawson Architecture, a firm he'd built from the ground up with his best friend, Robert Price. Marina was a respected art historian, a consultant for museums and private collectors, her mind as beautiful as the canvases she studied. Their life was a curated masterpiece. The first crack appeared as a hairline fracture almost invisible. It was Lionel's phone, which was suddenly always face down on the nightstand. It was the late nights at the office, blamed on a demanding new skyscraper project in the Seaport district. "The client is brutal, Marina," he'd say, kissing her forehead, his lips feeling strangely cool. Just a few more weeks of this grind. Marina, who had always trusted him, implicitly chose to believe him. They were trying for a baby, after all. The stress of that journey with its scheduled appointments and emotional roller coasters was a strain on them both. She reasoned that he was throwing himself into his work as a coping mechanism. She'd double her efforts to be the perfect supportive wife. She'd have his favorite meal, a slow braised lamb shank, ready when he stumbled in at 10 p.m. smelling of the crisp night air, and something else. Something faintly floral and unfamiliar. The fracture widened the day she stopped by his office, unannounced, with coffee and pastries. She walked into the sleek glass-walled reception area and was greeted by a young paralegal. "Oh, Mr. Dawson is in a client meeting," the woman said, her eyes darting away for a split second too long. But Marina could see into Lionel's office from where she stood. It was empty. His jacket was gone. "That's strange," Marina said, her voice light betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. "He told me he was swamped here all day." The paralegal offered a weak, practiced smile. He must have just stepped out. That evening, Lionel came home with a lavish bouquet of her favorite peonies. "A peace offering," he announced, his smile too bright. "For being so absent lately. I landed the final approval on the Seaport Tower. We're celebrating." He was charming, attentive, and utterly convincing. As he poured the champagne, Marina felt a wave of guilt for her earlier suspicion. He was working hard for them, for their future family. How could she have doubted him? They made love that night, with a desperation that felt less like passion and more like a farewell. The end came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday. It was clinical, brutal, and efficient. Marina was arranging a new collection of antique maps in her study when Lionel walked in. He didn't sit down. He stood by the door, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored trousers, looking like a handsome stranger in their home. "Marina, we need to talk," he began, using the tone he reserved for difficult clients. "Okay," she said slowly, putting down a 17th century map of Paris. "You look serious." "I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Marina felt the blood drain from her face. She thought she must have misheard. It was a joke, a terrible, unfunny joke. She looked at his face, searching for a flicker of humor in his hazel eyes. There was nothing but cold, hard resolution. "What?" she whispered. "I've fallen in love with someone else." He said the words coming out in a rehearsed rush. "Her name is Sienna Keller. She's a junior associate at the firm. I've been seeing her for 6 months. I'm sorry, Marina. I never meant to hurt you, but I can't live a lie anymore. I've already rented a new apartment. My things are packed." 6 months. The late nights, the secret calls, the floral perfume, it all crashed down on her at once. Every lie, every excuse, every moment of her own willful blindness. She had been a fool. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot poker searing through her chest. "Sienna Keller." Marina repeated the name, her voice trembling. A pretty ruthlessly ambitious brunette she'd met once at a company holiday party. The woman had shaken her hand, smiled a little too widely and said, "It's an honor to finally meet you. Lionel talks about you all the time." The audacity of it stole her breath. "How could you? Lionel?" The question was a fragile, broken thing. Our life, our home. We were trying for a baby. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of impatience. "It wasn't working, Marina. We weren't working. We've been growing apart for years. We were just going through the motions. Sienna, she makes me feel alive." He didn't just break her heart. He rewrote their entire history to justify his betrayal. He turned their 7 years of love and partnership into a hollow charade. "Get out," she said, the words barely audible. "My bags are in the hall," he said, as if discussing a business transaction. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours. I want to make this as smooth as possible. Get out." This time her voice was stronger, laced with the venom of a woman scorned. He turned and walked away without another word. Marina stood frozen in her study, surrounded by the beautiful things they had collected together. She heard the front door open, then click shut. The silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was a vast, echoing void, the sound of her world ending. She slid down the wall, the antique map of Paris crinkling beneath her, and finally let out the guttural, soul-shattering sob she had been holding back. The first contact from Lionel's lawyer, a piranha named Franklin Cole, came within 48 hours. The email was cold and concise, detailing Lionel's proposal for the divorce settlement. He would keep the firm his investment portfolio and the vacation condo in Vale. Marina would get the brownstone once the mortgage was refinanced, solely in her name, and a lump sum payment that was insultingly small a pittance for 7 years of her life and emotional investment. The subtext was clear. Take it, or I will drag you through a messy public battle you can't win. Marina felt too numb to fight. She forwarded the email to her own lawyer and tried to function moving through her house like a ghost. Everywhere she looked, she saw Lionel. His favorite armchair, the coffee mug he used every morning, the indentation his head had left on the pillow next to hers. Each object was a fresh stab of pain. Her best friend Brooke, a fiery journalist with zero tolerance for nonsense, descended on the house like a Valkyrie. She packed Lionel's remaining belongings, the books he'd left behind, the toiletries in the bathroom, his collection of single malt scotches, into boxes with ruthless efficiency. "We are performing an exorcism, Marina," Brooke declared, taping a box shut with a satisfying rip. "We are cleansing this house of his toxic, cheating energy." A week later, the real horror began. Marina was scrolling numbly through Instagram when a photo posted by one of Lionel's colleagues stopped her cold. It was a group shot from a dinner party. There in the center was Lionel, his arm wrapped possessively around Sienna Keller's waist. They were standing in front of the familiar deep blue feature wall of Robert Price's dining room. Sienna was beaming, wearing a slinky red dress, looking perfectly at home amongst Lionel's friends. The caption read, "Celebrating the Seaport Tower. Win with the power couple, Lionel and Sienna. Power couple." The term was a dagger to the heart. That had been their title, a loving joke between them. It got worse. Sienna was a master of the slow, deliberate takeover. She started by subtly inserting herself into Lionel's digital life, then his social life, and finally her physical life. Photos appeared of her redecorating Lionel's new, sterile, high-rise apartment. She posted pictures of herself, having brunch with the wives of Lionel's colleagues, women Marina had considered friends. They smiled for the camera, all of them, complicit in her erasure. The final soul-crushing blow came a month after Lionel had left. Marina received a certified letter. It was from Lionel's lawyer. He was exercising a clause in the prenuptial agreement she had barely remembered signing. It stated that in the event of a separation, the brownstone, which had been purchased primarily with funds from a significant bonus Lionel received just before their wedding, was to be sold with the profits split 70-30 in his favor. He was no longer giving her the house. He was kicking her out. Brooke was incandescent with rage. "He can't do this. That bastard is trying to make you homeless." But he could, and he was. Her lawyer confirmed it was ironclad. The generous man who had insisted the house was their forever home had in reality ensured he held all the cards from the very beginning. Marina had 30 days to vacate. The process of packing up her life was a slow-motion funeral. Each box she filled was another shovel of dirt on the grave of her marriage. One rainy afternoon, as she was sorting through the linen closet, she saw a car pull up outside a sleek white Porsche. Sienna Keller unfolded herself from the driver's seat. She was with a woman Marina recognized as a high-end interior designer. They stood on the sidewalk, Sienna pointing up at the brownstone's facade, talking and laughing as the designer took notes on a tablet. Sienna glanced up, and her eyes met Marina's through the window. For a moment, her smile faltered, but it was quickly replaced by a look of triumphant disdain. She gave a small, almost imperceptible wave, a gesture of pure mockery. She wasn't just taking Marina's husband. She was measuring the drapes in her home before her body was even cold. That was the moment something inside Marina snapped. The grief and the sorrow that had paralyzed her for weeks began to curdle, hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She wasn't just a victim. She was Marina Dawson, a woman who had built her own career, who had a mind and a will of her own. She would not be erased. She called her lawyer. "Forget the settlement negotiations. Don't respond to anything. Let them wonder what we're doing." "Marina, that could be risky," the lawyer advised. "Just do it." Marina said, her voice devoid of its earlier tremble. She booked a moving company for the following week. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Brooke. She packed her most precious belongings, her books, her research photos of her parents, and a small antique silver locket her grandmother had given her. She left everything else. The furniture, the art they had bought together, the kitchen appliances. She would let them have the shell of her old life. She was taking the soul. On her last night in the house, she wrote a single short note and left it on the marble island in the kitchen. Then, before the sun rose, she got in her car and drove away from Boston, her entire life packed into a few dozen boxes in a moving truck behind her, with no destination in mind other than away. When Lionel and Sienna finally entered the house with their designer, a week later, they found it eerily empty, save for the furniture. On the kitchen island lay the note. It wasn't angry or pleading. It was just 2 words written in Marina's elegant script. You win. The first month was a blur of cheap motels and long, empty highways. Marina drove west with no plan, fueled by coffee and a gnawing emptiness. She was a ghost, haunting the back roads of America. The silence of the car was her only companion, a space where she could finally scream, cry, and let the full weight of her loss consume her. In a dusty motel in Nebraska, she got the news that her divorce had been finalized. Lionel had won by default. He and Sienna had bought the brownstone. A victory for them, a footnote in her life. She eventually found herself on the Oregon coast in a small, wind-swept town called Cannon Beach. The raw, untamed beauty of the place spoke to her weary soul. The jagged silhouette of haystack rock against a perpetually misty sky, the thunderous roar of the Pacific. It was a landscape that didn't demand happiness. It simply existed, powerful and enduring, and it allowed her to do the same. She rented a small cottage set back from the beach, a cozy, salt-bleached place with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out onto the ocean. She changed her number, deleted her social media, and effectively vanished. For the first time in months, she felt a sliver of peace. The anonymity was a balm. Here she wasn't Lionel Dawson's discarded wife. She was just Marina, the quiet woman who took long walks on the beach and bought her groceries at the local co-op. It was during one of those long walks, about 2 months after her arrival, that the persistent nausea and fatigue she'd been blaming on stress and a poor diet became undeniable. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the pregnancy test in the small cottage bathroom. She had been so consumed by the divorce that she hadn't even considered the possibility. They had been trying for months, a process filled with charts, timings, and heartbreaking disappointment. It had never worked. Until now, the 2 pink lines that appeared on the stick felt like a cosmic joke. She was pregnant. Pregnant with the child of the man who had shattered her life and moved on without a backward glance. The first emotion was not joy, but pure, unadulterated terror. How could she do this alone? She was jobless, emotionally shattered, and completely isolated. For a full day she sat by the window watching the tide roll in and out, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. The terror slowly gave way to a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness. This wasn't Lionel's baby, not anymore. This was her baby. This was a piece of her future that he couldn't touch, couldn't rewrite, couldn't take away. This child, this tiny, improbable life, was not a reminder of what she had lost. It was her reason to rebuild. That decision became her anchor. She started to put down roots. She found a part-time job cataloguing archives for the local historical society, a quiet, methodical task that soothed her mind. She made friends with the owner of the town's only bookstore, a warm, witty woman named Patricia. She started painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned years ago, filling canvases with the moody blues and greys of the Oregon coast. As her belly grew, so did her strength. She followed the progress of Lionel and Sienna's life from a safe distance, using a private browser on a library computer. She saw the society pages gushing about their whirlwind romance. She saw the glossy magazine spread featuring their newly renovated brownstone, Sienna posing in Marina's old study, which had been transformed into a minimalist office. Each image was a small pinprick, but it no longer had the power to shatter her. It was like watching a film about 2 strangers. 9 months after she left Boston, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy in a quiet local hospital. She named him Owen, a name with no connection to Lionel's side of the family. He had her dark hair, but to her initial dismay, he had Lionel's hazel eyes. But when she looked into them, she didn't see her ex-husband's betrayal. She saw innocence potential, and a love so profound It remade her entire world. Owen became her everything. One afternoon, when Owen was a few months old, an email appeared in the new private account she used for work. The sender was a name she hadn't seen in years: Alistair Finch, her late grandfather's estate lawyer, a man well into his 80s. The subject line read, "Urgent regarding the Dawson marital trust." Curious, she opened it. Alistair explained that he had been trying to reach her. He had been reviewing the trust her grandfather had established for her upon his death, a fund she vaguely knew existed, but which Lionel, with his financial acumen, had always managed. Alistair had noticed some irregularities, some recent inquiries from Lionel's lawyers that had raised a red flag. He asked if she would be willing to speak with him. They arranged a video call. Alistair was a kind, sharp-eyed man who didn't mince words. "Marina," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Your grandfather was a very shrewd and somewhat cynical man. He adored you, but he never much cared for Lionel. He saw him as an ambitious operator." He went on to explain the trust's structure. It wasn't just a pot of money. It was a complex instrument designed to protect her and her direct descendants. The initial seed money for Price and Dawson architecture hadn't come from a bank loan as Lionel had always claimed. It had come directly from this trust. Furthermore, the deed to the brownstone was also tied to it. Lionel was the trustee, but Marina and her offspring were the sole beneficiaries. Then came the bombshell. "Your grandfather included a rather unique morality clause," Alistair said, peering over his spectacles. "He stipulated that if the acting trustee, that is Lionel, were to engage in an act of infidelity that directly led to the dissolution of the marriage, a series of events would be triggered. Full financial control of all assets, originating from the trust, would immediately revert to you, the primary beneficiary. The transfer is contingent on you providing irrefutable proof of the infidelity." Marina stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Alistair said, a grim smile on his face, "that your ex-husband's new life, his company's foundation and his home are all built on your grandfather's money, and according to this document, he has just defaulted on the terms of the loan. He just doesn't know it yet." For Lionel Dawson, victory tasted sweet, but the aftertaste was surprisingly bitter. He had everything he thought he wanted. He had the thriving firm, the beautiful home, and the stunning, vivacious woman on his arm. Sienna was a trophy, and he paraded her everywhere. She was brilliant at social functions, charming potential clients, and looking impeccable in couture. Their life was a whirlwind of galas, exclusive dinner parties, and weekend trips to the Hamptons. They were the city's new it couple. But beneath the glossy surface, cracks were beginning to show. The easy intellectual companionship he'd shared with Marina was absent. Conversations with Sienna rarely strayed from gossip social climbing and her endless desire for more. More jewelry, a faster car, a bigger renovation. She had an insatiable appetite for the trappings of wealth and a terrifyingly short attention span for anything that didn't directly benefit her. He found himself missing the small things. He missed discussing a foreign film with Marina over a bottle of cheap, robust red wine. He missed the way she would get lost in a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. He missed her quiet, steady presence, a warmth that had anchored him without him ever realizing it. Living with Sienna was like living with a firework, dazzling, exciting but ultimately exhausting, and leaving you with nothing but smoke. The renovation of the brownstone became a point of contention. Sienna had ripped out all the custom-built mahogany bookshelves Marina had designed, replacing them with stark white walls to display a single ridiculously expensive piece of modern art. The cozy lived-in kitchen was gutted and replaced with a cold professional-grade steel setup, that was rarely ever used for cooking. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a gallery, a showroom for their success. "It's an investment, darling," Sienna would say, waving a dismissive hand when he voiced a rare complaint. It's about image. People see this house, they see us, and they see success. That's what brings in the billion-dollar clients. His business partner, Robert Price, was Sienna's biggest cheerleader. "She's a shark, Lionel. In a good way, she's exactly what you needed to get to the next level," Robert would say, clapping him on the back. "Marina was sweet, but she was holding you back. She was too academic. Sienna understands the game." Lionel let himself be convinced, silencing the nagging voice in his head that told him he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd blown up his life for this. It had to be worth it. The pressure mounted. To fund their extravagant lifestyle, Lionel, encouraged by Robert, began taking bigger risks at the firm. They took on highly leveraged projects, borrowing heavily against their existing assets. His once cautious financial strategy became reckless, a high-stakes gamble to keep the money flowing. One evening he was working late, reviewing the firm's finances. A file caught his eye. Dawson Marital Trust, initial capitalization. He hadn't looked at it in years. He opened it, a wave of nostalgia, and something akin to guilt washing over him. He saw the initial transfer from Alistair Finch's office, the money that had started it all. He remembered Marina's grandfather, a stern but fair man, who had looked at him with unconcealed skepticism. Lionel had worked hard to prove him wrong, to show he was worthy of his granddaughter. And how had he repaid that he scrolled through the dense legal document, his eyes glazing over the complex clauses? He stopped on a section titled Clause 12B, Beneficiary Covenants. He skimmed the impenetrable legalese about fiduciary duty and marital stability. It seemed like standard boilerplate. He closed the file, shaking off the uneasy feeling. It was his money now, his firm. He had earned it. But the ghost of Marina lingered. Sometimes late at night, after Sienna was asleep, a remote, beautiful stranger beside him in their sprawling bed, he would find himself thinking about her. Where was she? Was she okay? He'd felt a pang of something sharp and painful when she'd simply vanished, leaving only that two-word note. He'd expected a fight-tears accusations. Her silent disappearance was more damning than any screaming match. It was a quiet judgment, an indication that he was no longer worth her time or her anger. He told himself it was for the best, a clean break. But as Sienna's demands grew more shrill and the pressure at work more intense, the memory of Marina's quiet grace and unwavering support became a constant, silent rebuke. He was living in a gilded cage of his own making, and the bars were beginning to feel cold and tight. The Foundation for Children's Arts Gala was the crowning achievement of Sienna's year-long social campaign. She had clawed her way onto the board and then ruthlessly maneuvered to have the event hosted at her home. It was her coronation as Boston's new Queen Bee. The brownstone was unrecognizable, transformed by event planners into a shimmering fantasy of white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and flowing champagne. Lionel stood beside her near the entrance, a fixed smile plastered on his face, as they greeted a procession of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures. Sienna was radiant in a silver sequined gown, her laughter sharp and bright. Lionel felt like a prop, an accessory to her ambition. "Robert is here," Sienna trilled, waving him over. "Doesn't everything look divine?" "Spectacular, Sienna. Truly," Robert said, kissing her cheek. He turned to Lionel. "Big night, my friend. After your speech tonight and the donation, we're about to announce the city contract for the new waterfront pavilion is ours for the taking." It was all connected. The The parties, the spending, the gala, it was all a calculated business move orchestrated by Sienna and Robert. Lionel felt a chill run down his spine. When had his life become so transactional? Later, Sienna tapped a microphone for attention. "Everyone, if I could have your attention. It's my great honor to introduce the man whose vision is reshaping our city's skyline, my incredible partner, Lionel Dawson." Polite applause rippled through the crowded room. Lionel walked to the makeshift stage at the base of the grand staircase, his heart heavy. He looked out at the sea of smiling, predatory faces, all of them there to network and posture. He cleared his throat, ready to deliver the speech Sienna had helped him write, a speech full of empty platitudes about community and art. "Thank you, Sienna," he began. "It's an honor to welcome you all into our home tonight." He never got to the next line. At that exact moment, the large oak doors to the brown stone, which had been closed to the public, swung silently open. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. The chatter in the room, which had already begun to rise, died instantly. Every head turned. The woman stepped forward into the light, and a collective audible gasp swept through the gala. It was Marina. But it was not the Marina anyone remembered. The soft, slightly academic woman was gone. In her place stood a vision of pure, unadulterated confidence. Her dark hair was cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She wore a simple, perfectly tailored emerald green dress that bespoke quiet, old-money elegance, a stark contrast to Sienna's flashy glitter. Her face was serene, her eyes clear and direct. She looked stronger, healthier, and more beautiful than Lionel had ever seen her. She was not alone. Cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, was a baby of about 10 months, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. The child had a dusting of dark hair and a perfect Cupid's bow mouth. Lionel felt the microphone slip from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor with a screech of feedback that echoed the scream in his own mind. The room was utterly silent, a tableau of frozen, shocked faces. Sienna's painted smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, venomous disbelief. Robert Price's jaw was slack. Marina's eyes scanned the room coolly, taking in the scene, the lavish decorations, the gawking guests, her ex-husband on the stage, and the woman standing beside him. Her gaze finally settled on Lionel. There was no hatred in her eyes, no pain. There was something far more terrifying, pity. She took a slow, deliberate step into the room. Then another. The soft click of her heels on the polished hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous silence. She walked towards the stage, her movements graceful and unhurried, a queen reclaiming her stolen kingdom. She stopped directly in front of Lionel, close enough that he could see the tiny sleeping face of the child in her arms. The baby stirred, opened his eyes, and looked up. They were a startling, familiar hazel. They were Lionel's eyes. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the cavernous room was the frantic, useless feedback from the microphone Lionel had dropped. Time itself seemed to warp and thicken every second, stretching into an eternity. From his position on the stage, Lionel saw the scene as a series of frozen, hyper-realistic paintings. He saw the flicker of avarice in one guest's eyes, the undisguised shock on another's. He saw Robert Price, his face a mask of confusion that was rapidly hardening into dread. He saw Sienna, her perfectly composed features fracturing like porcelain under a hammer. But most of all, he saw Marina. She stood there, a portrait of serene power, holding a child whose existence fundamentally rewrote Lionel's entire world. The spell shattered. The silence broke, not with a single sound, but with a tidal wave of them gasps, sharp whispers, the frantic tapping of thumbs on phone screens, as the city's elite began to broadcast the scandal of the decade. Sienna, recovering first, moved with the vicious speed of a cornered predator. Her survival instincts, honed by years of social climbing, took over. This was an attack, and it had to be neutralized. "What is the meaning of this?" She snarled, her voice dropping its musical party tone and taking on a low, dangerous edge. She took a step toward Marina, a clear gesture of territorial aggression. "Whatever pathetic, desperate stunt this is, you are not welcome here. Security!" She yelled towards the back of the room. "Escort this woman out!" Marina didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge Sienna's presence, an act of dismissal, so complete it was more insulting than any retort. Her gaze remained fixed on Lionel, who was still paralyzed on the stage, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality before him. "Hello, Lionel," she said again, her voice a calm, clear bell that cut through the rising chaos. "You look surprised. I suppose I should have called first." The quiet irony in her tone was a scalpel slicing through his shock. The baby in her arms, Owen made a soft, cooing sound, his small hand reaching up to touch the emerald fabric of his mother's dress. Is he? Lionel finally managed to croak the question dying in his throat. The words were too enormous, the implications too catastrophic to fully articulate. "His name is Owen," Marina replied, her voice steady and factual, as if she were discussing the weather. "He's 10 months old. You can do the math." A fresh wave of whispers, louder this time, rippled through the crowd. 10 months. It was a precise, damning timeline. The conception had occurred in the final fraught weeks of their marriage, during the period Lionel had told himself was a loveless lie. This child was not an afterthought. He was a direct consequence of a union Lionel had callously discarded. The confirmation seemed to ignite the fury in Sienna. The truth of the timeline meant this wasn't some random child Marina had adopted for show. This was a legitimate heir, a complication of the highest order. "I don't care who he is," Sienna shrieked, her carefully constructed composure completely disintegrating. "This is a pathetic attempt to ruin our night. Get out of my house." "My house?" Marina finally turned her head, her eyes sweeping over Sienna with a look of clinical pity. "That's a very interesting choice of words. Ownership is a complicated concept, isn't it? Which brings me to why I'm really here." With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards the back of the room, she gave the signal. As if on cue, the crowd parted. 2 figures walked forward with an air of undeniable purpose. The first was an elderly, distinguished man with piercing eyes and a spine of steel, Alistair Finch. The second was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in a severe business suit, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a weapon. Lionel Dawson. Alistair began, his powerful voice commanding immediate silence. "My name is Alistair Finch. I am the executor of the estate of Marina's late grandfather. This is Miss Albright, a forensic accountant. I believe it is past time you and I had a conversation regarding the specific covenants of the Dawson Marital Trust." The blood drained from Lionel's face. The trust, a file he hadn't looked at in years, a file he'd dismissed as boilerplate. He felt a cold dread, slick and oily, begin to creep up his spine. Robert Price, sensing a corporate threat far more dangerous than a mere domestic dispute, stepped forward to try and contain the situation. "Now look here," he said, attempting a placating tone. "This is a private party. I'm sure whatever this is about, it can be handled in a boardroom tomorrow." "Oh, I think it needs to be handled right now, Robert," Marina said, turning her piercing gaze on him. "Since you're so very central to the conversation." Ms. Albright opened her briefcase and passed a thick document to Alistair, who held it up. as per the Trust's specific infidelity clause, Clause 12b to be precise. He announced his voice, resonating with legal finality, upon the presentation of irrefutable proof that the marriage was dissolved as a direct result of the acting trustee's adultery, full financial and operational control of all assets, originating from the trust reverts, immediately and irrevocably, to the primary beneficiary Marina Dawson and her direct heir. He paused, gesturing pointedly at the sleeping Owen in her arms. Sienna let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "What assets? That's ridiculous. Lionel built his firm from the ground up with his own 2 hands." "Did he?" Marina countered her voice, dangerously soft. She was no longer just a wronged wife. She was an executioner. "Ms. Albright, would you perhaps care to share what your audit of the firm's capitalization revealed?" The forensic accountant stepped forward, her expression impassive. "Our audit traced the financial origins of Price and Dawson Architecture. 100% of the initial seed capital, a sum of $2 million, was disbursed directly from the trust in question. Furthermore, the down payment for this property and all subsequent mortgage payments until your separation were also paid from trust funds. Legally, she concluded, letting the words land like hammer blows. The firm's foundational assets and this house are not and have never been personal assets of Mr. Dawson. They belong to the trust." The room erupted. This was a language every person in attendance understood: money. Lionel felt the very ground of his identity. The self-made man, the architectural genius, turned to quicksand beneath him. His entire success story was a lie. He had been playing with house money, and the house had just come to collect. But Marina wasn't finished. She let the financial shock settle for a moment before delivering the killing blow. Her eyes found Robert Price, who was now sweating profusely. "It's truly amazing what you can find out when you start digging into the finances," she said, her tone conversational, which made the words all the more chilling. "You start to see patterns. For instance, you learn about a promising junior associate named Sienna Keller, who was struggling with a rather significant amount of student loan and gambling debt. You learn how a rival firm, desperate to underbid you on the new waterfront pavilion project, might see an opportunity. How they might approach your disgruntled partner, Robert, and offer to pay off Miss Keller's debts in exchange for her services." She let the accusation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. Robert went corpse-like pale. That is a preposterous, slanderous lie," he stammered. "Is it?" Marina raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Because Miss Albright is quite gifted at following the money. She traced a series of large anonymous payments into Ms. Keller's offshore accounts, payments that originated from a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation that happens to be owned by your brother-in-law." It was over. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The crowd collectively turned to stare at Robert and Sienna. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Sienna hadn't just been an affair. She was a weapon. Robert, his best friend, his partner for 15 years, the man with whom he had shared dreams and bottles of scotch, had not only condoned the affair, but had orchestrated it for financial gain. Every late-night strategy session, every congratulatory handshake, every word of encouragement had been a lie. Lionel's mind fractured. He looked at Sienna, and he no longer saw the vibrant, exciting woman he'd craved. He saw a paid actress, a stranger whose every touch and whisper had been part of a script. He looked at Robert, and he didn't see a friend. He saw a serpent who had been coiled at his side for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His success, his home, his friendship, his love, it was all a grand, hollow fraud. Alistair Finch's voice cut through his internal agony, delivering the final verdict. The trust documents are ironclad. As of this moment, Miss Marina Dawson is assuming full control of all trust assets. Lionel, you are hereby removed as trustee, effective immediately. The firm's assets are frozen, pending a full audit and restructuring under her sole direction, and you have 48 hours to vacate this property. The last vestiges of Sienna's composure shattered. The money, the status, the power, it was all tied to. Lionel was now worthless. No, she shrieked, whirling on him, her face a mask of primal greed and terror. Fix this, you have to fix this. This can't be happening. But Lionel didn't hear her. He was no longer looking at the architects of his ruin. His gaze was fixed across the room at the only real things left in it. He saw his son, Owen, who had begun to stir his small face, peaceful and innocent. And he saw Marina, the woman he had thrown away, a woman who had weathered the ultimate storm of betrayal, not by breaking, but by becoming the storm itself. She stood there calm and victorious, holding the life he should have had, the love he had so foolishly squandered. He hadn't just lost a company or a house. He had lost everything that had ever truly mattered. The aftermath of Marina's return was not a slow decay, but an instantaneous implosion. The moment the truth detonated in the center of the room, the glittering facade of the gala shattered into a million pieces. The frantic whispers turned into a cacophony of undisguised gossip. Guests who moments before had been vying for Lionel's attention now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were sharks who had scented blood, and they were backing away from the carnage, eager to recount the story of his spectacular demise. Goodbyes were hasty air, kisses were abandoned, and the room emptied with a speed that was in itself a brutal judgment. In the ensuing chaos, Sienna rounded on Lionel, her beautiful face twisted into an ugly snarl of panic and rage. "This is your fault!" She spat her voice, a venomous whisper that was somehow louder than the surrounding din. "You and your pathetic sentimental history. I told you to crush her, to leave her with nothing." She was a corporate spy, Sienna. Lionel said the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "You were paid to do this." "I was paid to get results." She shot back, her eyes wild. "And I did. We had it all. The money, this house, the respect. And you let her walk in here and take it away. You are weak, Lionel. You were always weak." She looked around the opulent room at the wilting orchids and the abandoned champagne flutes, her gaze lingering on the life that was evaporating before her eyes. With a final disgusted look at him, she turned and stormed up the grand staircase. By the time the last caterer had cleared out in the pre-dawn hours, Sienna was gone. Her closets were empty, her jewelry box bare. She had vanished as quickly and completely as she had appeared, leaving behind only the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the deep, permanent crater she had made of his life. Lionel was left alone in the vast, echoing shell of the brownstone. The next 48 hours passed in a surreal, suffocating haze. He wandered through the rooms Sienna had so coldly curated, her minimalist aesthetic, now feeling like a monument to his own hollowness. He saw ghosts everywhere. In the study, he didn't see Sienna's sterile white desk, but the memory of Marina's beloved mahogany shelves overflowing with books that smelled of paper and time. In the kitchen, the gleaming, unused steel appliances seemed to mock the memory of shared meals of Marina's flour-dusted hands kneading dough on a Sunday morning. Every object was a testament to his catastrophic error in judgment. He had traded the authentic for the artificial substance, for style love, for an illusion of power. He had believed Sienna's ambition was a reflection of his own, when in reality it was a parasitic entity that had merely used him as a host. He had believed Robert was his friend, his brother, when he had been nothing more than a co-conspirator in his own ruin. On the final afternoon, with the movers scheduled to arrive the next morning to inventory the trust's assets, he sat down at the cold marble island in the kitchen. He thought of Marina's two-word note, "You win," and a wave of profound shame washed over him. She hadn't been surrendering. She had been letting him hang himself with the rope he'd so eagerly fashioned. He took out a single sheet of paper and a pen. He didn't write to make excuses or to beg for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. He wrote to confess. He filled the page with the truth of his weakness, his ego, his monumental foolishness. He apologized for his lies, his cruelty for shattering something so precious with such careless hands. It was a paltry offering, a drop of remorse in an ocean of wreckage, but it was all he had left. He left the letter on the island, a final futile echo of a conversation he should have had a lifetime ago. Then, with a single suitcase containing the few things that were truly his, he walked out of the house for the last time. Marina, meanwhile, moved with the cool, swift efficiency of her newfound power. She never set foot in the brownstone again. Through Alistair, she gave the instructions: sell everything in it, liquidate it all. It was a place of ghosts and pain, the tombstone of a life she no longer wanted. With the reclaimed assets from her grandfather's trust, she didn't attempt to piece together her old world. She built a new one from the ground up. She bought a beautiful sun-drenched historic home in Cambridge, a place with a sprawling garden where Owen could play and tall windows that let the light pour in. She established the Finch and Dawson Arts Foundation in honor of her grandfather and Alistair's loyalty, creating a legacy of meaning. She poured her time and energy into her work, and most importantly, into her son. His laughter was the only sound that mattered, now the steady, happy rhythm of her new, uncompromised life. Several months later, a formal letter arrived from Lionel's new, far less prestigious lawyer. It was a humble request for a meeting not to discuss assets or legalities, but for a personal matter. After a week of consideration, she agreed. They met in a public park halfway between her new life and whatever was left of his. She saw him on a bench near the duck pond before he saw her. The impeccably tailored suits were gone, replaced by simple trousers and a worn jacket. The confident, predatory swagger had been replaced by a stoop in his shoulders. When he finally looked up and saw her approaching with Owen in her arms, the expression on his face was one of raw, unshielded pain. He stood awkwardly as she approached. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. "I'm here," she replied, her tone neutral. She did not sit. His eyes fell to the boy in her arms. Owen, curious and unafraid, looked back at him, his own hazel eyes wide. A choked sound escaped Lionel's throat. It was the first time he had seen his son up close in the clear light of day. He didn't ask for a second chance for her, for them. He seemed to know that was a door he had sealed shut forever. His request was smaller, more fragile. Can I know him?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Owen. "I don't expect to be a father, not in the way I should have been. I forfeited that right. But I'd like to see him, to be a small part of his life, if you'll let me. He deserves to know. To know his father wasn't always a monster." Marina looked from Lionel's broken face to her son's innocent one. For a fleeting moment, the searing anger of his betrayal threatened to surface. The memory of Sienna's smug wave of being discarded like refuse was a scar that would never fully fade. It would be so easy to say no, to punish him forever, to deny him the one thing he now seemed to crave. But as she looked at Owen, she knew that vengeance was a poison. It would not heal her, and it might one day harm her son. "He can see you on weekends," she said, her voice steady and firm, a decision forged in the crucible of her own strength, not his weakness. "Supervised at first. We will see how it goes. But Lionel—" She met his eyes, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of her words. "You and I are over. That will never change." A tear traced a path down his cheek, the first she had ever seen him shed. "I know," he whispered, a universe of regret in those two words. "Thank you, Marina, for your mercy." She gave him a slight, final nod of acknowledgement. There was nothing more to say. She adjusted Owen in her arms, feeling his small, warm weight against her heart. She turned and began to walk away toward the sunlit patch of grass where other children were playing. She didn't look back. The sounds of the park, the distant laughter, the rustling leaves, the gentle quacking of the ducks were the soundtrack to her new beginning. Lionel Dawson remained on the bench, a solitary figure left in the cold ashes of a life he had incinerated himself forever, watching the woman and the son he had lost walk into a new dawn without him. This was a story of ultimate betrayal, but it was also a story of incredible resilience. It shows how the quietest person in the room can sometimes be the most powerful, and how the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. Marina's journey from a heartbroken wife to a triumphant, independent mother is a testament to the strength that can be forged in the fires of adversity. She didn't just get revenge. She got her life back on her own terms. What would you have done in Marina's place? Would you have been as calculated, or would you have walked away forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strength and shocking twists resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and subscribing to the channel for more stories that feel like they're ripped straight from real life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a single gripping tale. Thank you for listening.